The static crackled through the ancient radio equipment like the dying breaths of civilization itself. But Marcus Thompson had learned to distinguish between meaningless interference and something that might actually matter. 3 years of living in the skeletal remains of Chicago's WGCI radio station had taught him that hope was a luxury few could afford. Yet something in tonight's transmission made his battle-scarred hands tremble as he adjusted the frequency dial. The voice emerged from the white noise like a ghost materializing from fog. Clear, authoritative, unmistakably military. "This is Command Station Alpha broadcasting on emergency frequency 77.5. The cure has been synthesized. Repeat, we have a working cure for the infection. All surviving personnel and civilians, coordinates follow. 38 degrees, 53 minutes north, 77 degrees, 02 minutes west. Evacuation Protocol Zulu is in effect. You have 72 hours to reach the designated zone." Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he frantically scribbled down the coordinates. His military training from another lifetime kicking in despite the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. Behind him, Elena Rodriguez looked up from the motorcycle engine she'd been rebuilding with parts salvaged from the street below, her grease-stained fingers freezing mid-motion as she caught the urgency in his posture. Dr. James Mitchell, who'd been studying blood samples under an improvised microscope by the window, slowly removed his glasses and turned toward the radio with the expression of a man who'd heard too many false promises to believe in miracles. The twins, Katie and Josh Harrison, emerged from their corner where they'd been playing a silent card game, their 18-year-old faces bearing the premature lines of those who'd grown up in hell and learned that laughter attracted the wrong kind of attention. "Did you hear that?" Marcus whispered. Though whispering had become their default volume during the 3 years since the dead began walking the earth with an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Elena wiped her hands on her coveralls and moved closer, her dark eyes reflecting both hope and the hard-earned skepticism of someone who'd survived by trusting no one completely. "Washington, D.C., she said quietly, recognizing the coordinates before Marcus could calculate them. "That's over 700 miles from here, through territory that makes this place look like a vacation resort." Dr. Mitchell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the group with the analytical gaze that had served him well as a veterinarian before the world ended, and even better as their de facto medical officer afterward. "Military broadcasts have been used to lure survivors into traps before," he reminded them, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. "Remember what happened to the group from Milwaukee? They followed a similar transmission, and we never heard from them again." Josh Harrison, the quieter of the twins, looked up from sharpening a knife that had become his most trusted companion. "But what if it's real?" he asked, voicing the question that hung in the air like smoke from their carefully contained fires. "What if there actually is a cure, and we're sitting here debating while other people get saved?" Katie nodded agreement with her brother, her blonde hair catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the boarded windows. "We can't stay here forever," she added. "Food's running low, and those things are getting bolder. Yesterday I saw a group of them actually working together to push over that barricade on State Street." Marcus knew she was right. The zombies were evolving, becoming more coordinated, more dangerous. The shambling corpses of the early days had given way to something that retained enough cognitive function to use simple problem-solving, and lately, they'd been displaying behavior that suggested they were learning. Elena stood and walked to the reinforced window, peering through the narrow gap between boards at the street below, where shadows moved with purposes that had nothing to do with the living. 700 miles, she repeated thoughtfully. "My bike could make it if we can find enough fuel, but we'd need to travel light and fast. The interstates are probably death traps, which means back roads through small towns where every house could be hiding a nest." Dr. Mitchell joined her at the window, his trained eye scanning the darkening streets for movement. "The infection rate in rural areas was actually higher initially," he mused. "Smaller communities, closer family units, less likely to take the early warnings seriously. Those places might be completely overrun. The radio transmission repeated every 20 minutes, Marcus noted, each repetition identical to the last, which could mean it was automated or could mean they had a disciplined communications officer following protocol. His military experience told him that real emergency broadcasts usually contained more detailed information, authentication codes, specific instructions for different groups of survivors. This message was almost too clean, too perfect, like something designed to appeal to desperate people who wanted to believe in salvation. As if summoned by their discussion of hope and desperation, a low moan echoed from somewhere in the building below them, followed by another, then another. Elena cursed softly in Spanish and grabbed her crowbar, while the twins instinctively moved to opposite corners of the room, following the survival tactics they developed through bitter experience. Dr. Mitchell quickly began packing his medical supplies, and Marcus checked his rifle while mentally calculating how many rounds they had left. The moaning grew louder, multiplied, and was joined by the distinctive sound of shuffling feet and bodies pressing against the barriers they'd so carefully constructed. "Looks like we're making this decision faster than planned," Marcus said grimly, recognizing the sound of a growing horde. The radio signal had been broadcasting for hours, and it seemed they weren't the only ones who'd heard it. But whatever else had been drawn to their location by the electromagnetic emissions wasn't interested in salvation, only in the warm blood pumping through their veins. The emergency escape route Elena had discovered 3 weeks earlier proved to be their salvation, as the building above them filled with the hungry groans and scratching claws of what sounded like dozens of infected. The narrow maintenance tunnel behind the radio station's basement led to the old Chicago Transit Authority service corridors, a maze of forgotten passages that had once carried repair crews beneath the city's bustling streets, but now served as highways for the desperate living trying to avoid the ravenous dead. Marcus led the way with his rifle ready, followed by Dr. Mitchell carrying his precious medical supplies, then the Harrison twins with their backpacks stuffed with salvaged food and ammunition, and finally Elena bringing up the rear with her mechanical tools and a crowbar that had saved their lives more times than any of them cared to count. The tunnels reeked of decay and stagnant water, but after 3 years of living in a world where fresh air was a luxury, they barely noticed the smell as they navigated by the pale beam of Marcus's dying flashlight. 20 minutes into their underground journey, they encountered the first signs that they weren't alone in the depths beneath Chicago. Fresh boot prints in the mud, recently extinguished torch remnants, and most tellingly, barricades that had been constructed with an engineer's precision rather than a survivor's desperate improvisation. Katie Harrison whispered a warning as she spotted movement ahead, and the group froze as voices echoed through the tunnel system. Too distant to make out words, but clearly human and very much alive. Elena signaled for silence as she crept forward to investigate, her mechanic's knowledge of building layouts helping her navigate the branching passages until she found herself observing a remarkable sight. 37 survivors, including women, children, and elderly individuals, living in a well-organized underground camp complete with sleeping areas, a communal kitchen, and posted sentries. Leading this subterranean community was Captain Rebecca Foster, a former Chicago police officer whose authoritative bearing and tactical vest marked her as someone who'd managed to maintain both discipline and humanity in a world that had abandoned both. Foster's lieutenant, a young man named Danny Reeves who couldn't have been more than 25, approached Elena with his weapon lowered, but ready as she emerged from the shadows with her hands visible and empty. The reunion that followed felt almost surreal after months of believing they might be the only living people left in the city, and Elena's group found themselves sharing their meager supplies around a small fire, while Foster's people peppered them with questions about the surface world and the mysterious radio transmission that had drawn the zombie horde to their building. Foster listened intently as Marcus recounted the Washington, D.C. coordinates and the promise of a cure, her weathered face showing the skepticism of someone who'd learned that hope could be more dangerous than despair if it led people into foolish risks. "We've been picking up military chatter for the past week," Foster admitted, gesturing toward a sophisticated radio setup that made Marcus's equipment look primitive by comparison. "My communications officer, Angela Park, has been monitoring multiple frequencies, and she's detected convoy movements heading east toward the capital. Either something big is happening, or someone's setting an elaborate trap for survivors foolish enough to believe in fairy tales." Dr. Mitchell found himself in animated discussion with Foster's medic, a former nurse named Robert Chun, comparing notes about infection patterns and the disturbing changes they'd both observed in zombie behavior over recent months. The infected were definitely becoming more coordinated, Chun confirmed, and his group had documented instances of zombies using simple tools and even displaying what appeared to be tactical thinking during attacks on their defensive positions. Josh Harrison struck up a conversation with some of Foster's younger survivors, learning that this underground community had developed an impressive intelligence network spanning several miles of tunnel systems, with scouts who ventured to the surface regularly to gather supplies and information about zombie movements. The picture that emerged from their collective knowledge was sobering. The surface world had become increasingly dangerous, with massive herds of infected moving in organized patterns that suggested either evolutionary adaptation or external control. As the two groups shared their evening meal of canned goods and carefully rationed water, Foster presented them with disturbing intelligence her scouts had gathered about the route to Washington, D.C. The highways were completely impassable, choked with abandoned vehicles and roaming hordes that could number in the thousands, while the smaller roads passed through rural communities that had become zombie-infested death traps where entire towns wandered the streets in eternal hunger. More troubling still were reports of military checkpoints that survivors had entered, but from which no one had ever emerged, and strange aircraft that had been spotted carrying cargo containers toward the capital region under heavy armed escort. Elena studied the hand-drawn maps Foster's people had created, noting the locations marked as absolutely avoid and possible safe passage, while Marcus calculated fuel requirements and travel times with the grim precision of someone planning a mission with minimal chance of success. The decision to combine their groups came naturally after Foster revealed that her scouts had reported military vehicles moving through the outer suburbs, following routes that suggested they too were heading toward the coordinates mentioned in the radio transmission. 30 people are easier to spot than 5, Foster acknowledged, but they're also harder to kill if we're walking into an ambush. Her experience as a police officer had taught her that criminals often use distress calls to lure victims into traps, and she suspected that whoever was broadcasting the cure announcement might be employing similar tactics on a massive scale. Dr. Mitchell raised the most disturbing possibility of all as they planned their route. What if the cure was real, but the people offering it had no intention of sharing it freely? The coordinates pointed to a location near several major government facilities, including research installations that had been studying biological weapons before the outbreak began, and his veterinary background had given him enough knowledge of infectious diseases to recognize that any cure would be incredibly valuable to whoever controlled it. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the tunnel system the next morning, Foster's communications officer intercepted a fragmentary transmission that chilled them all. Collection quota increased to 500 specimens. Phase 2 testing requires fresh subjects. Maintain containment until transport arrives. The message cut off abruptly, but its implications were clear enough to make even the most optimistic members of their group wonder if they were walking toward salvation or directly into the hands of people who saw survivors not as human beings to be rescued, but as raw materials for something far more sinister than any of them could imagine. The military checkpoint appeared like a mirage of hope in the wasteland that had once been the Chicago suburbs, its clean white tents and uniformed soldiers standing in stark contrast to 3 years of decay and death that surrounded them on all sides. Colonel William Anderson emerged from the command tent with the bearing of a career military officer, his crisp uniform and confident smile seeming almost impossibly normal after months of encountering only desperate survivors and mindless infected. His handshake was firm as he greeted Foster and Marcus, his blue eyes crinkling with what appeared to be genuine relief as he counted their numbers and began issuing orders to his subordinates about food distribution and medical evaluation. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, offering hot meals from field kitchens that filled the air with aromas none of the survivors had experienced since the world ended, while medics began examining the group members with professional thoroughness that suggested they'd been processing refugees for some time. Dr. Mitchell found himself cautiously optimistic as he observed the medical equipment and supplies, noting that these soldiers had access to antibiotics, surgical instruments, and diagnostic tools that could revolutionize survival prospects for any injured or sick members of their group. Elena watched the proceedings with a suspicious eye of someone who'd learned that anything too good to be true usually was. But even she began to relax as she saw Katie and Josh Harrison laughing with some of the younger soldiers who were sharing stories and showing them photographs of families they claimed to have successfully evacuated to safety zones in the east. Colonel Anderson personally briefed Marcus and Foster on the situation, explaining that his unit was part of Operation Phoenix, a massive government effort to locate survivors and transport them to secure facilities where the cure was being administered under controlled medical conditions. According to Anderson, the radio broadcasts were deliberately vague to prevent infected hordes from overwhelming the evacuation points, but legitimate survivors would be processed through checkpoints like this one before being transported to the primary facility near Washington, D.C. The story sounded plausible, backed up by official-looking documentation and radio communications with other military units, but Dr. Mitchell began noticing small details that troubled his scientific mind. Several of the soldiers exhibited subtle symptoms that reminded him of early-stage infection, including slightly clouded corneas, delayed reaction times, and a tendency to stare just a bit too long without blinking. When he mentioned his concerns to Marcus during their evening meal, the former communications specialist agreed to keep watch while pretending to sleep, positioning himself where he could observe the command tent and monitor radio transmissions without being detected. What Marcus overheard during the late-night hours made his blood run cold as Anderson spoke in hushed tones with someone identified only as Control about delivery schedules, specimen quality, and something called Phase 2 testing protocols. The conversation included references to fresh subjects showing optimal stress responses and maintaining the fiction until transport arrives tomorrow morning, making it clear that the survivors weren't being rescued, but collected for purposes that had nothing to do with their safety or well-being. Marcus spent the remaining hours of darkness carefully waking the other members of their group, using hand signals and whispered warnings to alert them to the danger without attracting attention from the sentries who patrolled the perimeter with weapons that were ostensibly pointed outward, but could easily be turned inward if the situation required. Foster's police training served them well as she coordinated a silent evacuation plan that would get her people out of the camp before dawn. But their careful preparations were discovered when one of Anderson's soldiers noticed Elena attempting to retrieve her mechanical tools from the equipment storage area. The ensuing confrontation erupted into violence as Anderson's true nature emerged, his friendly demeanor replaced by cold calculation as he ordered his men to secure all survivors for immediate transport, explaining with chilling matter-of-factness that their government contracts required delivery of specific numbers of test subjects within designated time frames. The battle that followed was chaotic and desperate, with Foster's people using every combat skill they developed during 3 years of fighting zombies, while Anderson's soldiers deployed military-grade weapons and tactics that proved they'd been planning for exactly this scenario. Elena managed to sabotage several of the camp's vehicles before being forced to abandon her tools and flee with the others, but they lost precious time and several group members in the process, including Foster's Lieutenant Danny Reeves and 2 of the elderly survivors who couldn't move quickly enough to escape the soldiers' pursuit. Dr. Mitchell was forced to leave behind his carefully gathered medical supplies and research notes as they scattered into the pre-dawn darkness, following an escape route that Foster had identified during their initial reconnaissance of the checkpoint surroundings. The revelation that Anderson's operation was capturing rather than rescuing survivors added a new layer of horror to their situation, suggesting that the government or military forces behind the radio transmissions had developed into something far more sinister than anyone had imagined possible. As they regrouped several miles from the checkpoint, hiding in an abandoned gas station while Anderson's vehicles searched the area with spotlights and loudspeakers, broadcasting false assurances about medical treatment and safety, Foster counted their remaining numbers and realized they'd lost nearly a third of their people to what amounted to an elaborate kidnapping operation disguised as humanitarian relief. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance suggested that Anderson had called for reinforcements, while the intermittent growls and moans from the surrounding darkness reminded them that their violent escape had attracted the attention of every zombie within miles of the checkpoint. Marcus attempted to raise other survivor groups on his portable radio, hoping to warn them about Anderson's deception. But the airwaves filled with similar distress calls from communities that had apparently fallen for the same trap, creating a picture of coordinated operations designed to round up survivors across multiple states for purposes that none of them wanted to contemplate. The twins huddled together in the corner of the gas station, their youthful optimism finally cracking under the weight of realizing that the adults they trusted to protect them had been systematically betrayed by the very authorities who should have represented hope and salvation. While Elena methodically checked her remaining weapons and prepared for what promised to be a running battle across hostile territory with enemies who possessed superior equipment, training, and resources that made survival seem increasingly impossible. The abandoned copper mine outside Peoria had been forgotten by the world long before the dead began walking, its entrance hidden behind rusted equipment and overgrown vegetation that provided perfect camouflage for the most unlikely sanctuary Marcus and his diminished group had ever encountered. Thomas Blake emerged from the darkness like a specter of scientific redemption, his CDC identification badge still hanging around his neck despite being stained with 3 years of desperate survival. His graying beard and hollow eyes telling the story of a man who'd witnessed humanity's darkest hour from the inside and lived to fight against it. Blake's underground resistance consisted of 43 individuals, including former government scientists, military defectors, medical professionals, and ordinary citizens who discovered the horrifying truth about the zombie outbreak and dedicated their remaining lives to exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed civilization. The mine's tunnels had been converted into a sophisticated operations center complete with laboratories carved from rock walls, communication equipment that rivaled anything Foster's group had possessed, and weapons caches that suggested these people had been preparing for war against their own government for months or possibly years. Dr. Mitchell found himself in animated discussion with Blake's chief researcher, Dr. Angela Morrison, a former virologist from the Atlanta CDC facility who'd escaped during the initial outbreak with crucial data about the biological weapons development and deployment protocols. According to Morrison's research, the zombie pathogen hadn't been an accident or naturally occurring pandemic, but rather a deliberately engineered bioweapon designed for population control that had exceeded its creator's expectations and broken free from laboratory containment in a cascade of institutional failures and cover-up attempts. Blake himself had been present during the early meetings where government officials discussed using controlled zombie outbreaks to eliminate undesirable populations, while preserving infrastructure and resources for post-crisis reconstruction under authoritarian control. But the weapon had proven impossible to contain once released, and had ultimately consumed the very people who'd created it. The resistance had been intercepting government communications for over a year, documenting the systematic collection of survivors for experimental purposes, including attempts to create hybrid human-zombie soldiers, research into weaponizing the infection for military applications, and most disturbing of all, efforts to develop a controllable strain that would create docile zombie workers for labor-intensive reconstruction projects. Elena listened in growing horror as Blake described the network of collection facilities disguised as refugee centers, medical treatment stations, and military checkpoints that were funneling survivors towards central processing locations where they were subjected to medical experimentation, psychological conditioning, and ultimately conversion into various types of zombie variants depending on the needs of specific government projects. The immunity booster that Blake's team had developed represented their most significant breakthrough, a temporary treatment that could prevent zombie infection for approximately 72 hours and slow the progression of existing infections. But their production capabilities were severely limited by lack of proper laboratory equipment and the constant threat of discovery by government forces. Marcus studied the intelligence reports Blake's people had compiled about Anderson's operation, learning that the colonel was just one of dozens of military officers involved in survivor collection activities across the former United States, each unit competing to meet quotas established by shadow government officials who'd survived the initial outbreak in deep underground bunkers, and were now attempting to rebuild society according to their own twisted vision. Foster's remaining people integrated quickly with Blake's resistance, their combat experience and tactical knowledge proving invaluable as the mine came under immediate threat from Anderson's forces, who'd apparently tracked their escape route using military-grade surveillance equipment and zombie tracking methods that the resistance had never encountered before. The attack began at dawn with explosive charges that collapsed several of the mine's secondary tunnels, followed by the systematic deployment of weaponized zombies on chains guided by soldiers wearing specialized protective equipment that allowed them to control the infected like living weapons against the resistance fighters. Blake's people fought with desperate courage, using improvised explosives, modified mining equipment, and their intimate knowledge of the tunnel system to create a defensive strategy that turned the mine into a deadly maze for Anderson's soldiers. But the government forces possessed superior numbers, better equipment, and tactical advantages that made the outcome increasingly predictable. Dr. Mitchell found himself treating wounded resistance fighters in a makeshift medical station deep within the mine, while Elena worked frantically to rig explosive charges that could bring down entire sections of tunnel if the government forces breached their final defensive perimeters, her mechanical skills proving essential as she converted mining equipment into weapon systems and defensive barriers. The twins Katie and Josh Harrison had never experienced combat on this scale, but they adapted quickly to the underground warfare, using their youth and agility to serve as messengers between different sections of the mine, while carrying ammunition and supplies to fighters pinned down by government forces who seemed willing to sacrifice unlimited numbers of soldiers and zombies to capture the resistance leadership alive. As the battle raged through interconnected tunnels filled with smoke, gunfire, and the screams of both living and dead combatants, Blake made the agonizing decision to activate his ultimate contingency plan. A series of controlled cave-ins that would seal the mine permanently, trapping Anderson's forces inside, but also cutting off the Resistance's primary base of operations and forcing them to abandon months of accumulated supplies, research data, and strategic planning materials. The explosion that followed shook the ground for miles around, bringing down thousands of tons of rock and earth while creating a burial ground for government soldiers, weaponized zombies, and several resistance fighters who'd volunteered to remain behind and ensure the charges detonated properly. Marcus led the survivors through a narrow escape tunnel that Blake had kept secret even from his own people, emerging into daylight to find themselves once again refugees with limited supplies, no permanent shelter, and the knowledge that their enemies possessed resources and determination that made their previous struggles seem almost trivial by comparison, while the distant sound of helicopters suggested that Anderson's operation was larger and more persistent than any of them had dared to imagine. The Westfield shopping mall had been transformed into something that defied everything Marcus thought he knew about post-apocalypse survival. Its vast interior spaces converted into a thriving community that hummed with purposeful activity and ingenious defensive systems that made it seem more like a fortress than a refuge. Maria Santos greeted them at the main entrance with the confident bearing of someone who'd not merely survived the collapse of civilization, but had actively rebuilt it according to her own engineering vision. Her former career in structural design evident in every carefully planned modification that had converted retail spaces into residential areas, workshops, medical facilities, and command centers connected by secure walkways and communication systems. The mall's anchor stores had become specialized community centers. The former department store served as living quarters for families with children. The electronics retailer had been converted into a communications hub that monitored radio traffic across multiple states. The bookstore had become an educational center where children learned both traditional subjects and practical survival skills, while the old food court had been expanded into a production facility where residents manufactured everything from ammunition to medical supplies using materials salvaged from the surrounding suburban wasteland. Santos explained their community's success with the pride of someone who'd proven that human ingenuity could triumph over impossible circumstances, describing how her team of engineers, mechanics, doctors, teachers, and ordinary citizens had created a self-sustaining society that traded regularly with other survivor groups, maintained detailed intelligence networks about safe travel routes, and had even established diplomatic relationships with several military units that had broken away from the government's collection operations to protect civilian populations. The mall's defense systems impressed even Foster's experienced tactical eye, featuring reinforced barriers that could seal off sections of the building during attacks, elevated sniper positions that provided clear fields of fire across the parking areas, early warning systems that detected approaching threats at distances of several miles, and most remarkably, a series of underground tunnels that connected to nearby buildings and provided multiple escape routes if the main facility became compromised. Elena found herself fascinated by the workshop areas where Santos's people had converted retail spaces into manufacturing centers, producing solar panels from salvaged electronics, water purification systems from plumbing supplies, and weapons modifications that improve the reliability and effectiveness of scavenged firearms and makeshift weapons. Dr. Mitchell was amazed by their medical facilities, which included a fully equipped surgical suite, pharmaceutical production capability, using chemistry equipment salvaged from a nearby college, and research laboratories where Santos's team had been studying zombie behavior patterns and developing treatments for injuries and illnesses that had become common in the post-apocalypse world. The integration process seemed almost too smooth as Blake's surviving resistance members found themselves assigned to work details that matched their skills and experience, while the Harrison twins discovered other teenagers who'd grown up during the outbreak and shared similar experiences of learning to fight, scavenge, and survive in a world that had abandoned the concepts of childhood innocence and carefree youth. Santos's intelligence network had been tracking Anderson's collection operations for months, she revealed during their evening briefing, and her scouts had documented the systematic elimination of survivor communities that refused to cooperate with government forces, the establishment of processing facilities in major cities, and most disturbing of all, reports from escaped prisoners describing medical experiments that seemed designed to create different categories of zombie variants for specific military and labor applications. The community's reluctance to assist with Blake's mission to reach Washington, D.C. became understandable when Santos explained that previous groups seeking the rumored cure had never returned, and her people had intercepted communications suggesting that the coordinates being broadcast were actually collection points for a massive final phase of the government's survivor processing program. The debate about whether to continue their journey or remain in the relative safety of the mall was interrupted by urgent warnings from the perimeter scouts who reported unusual zombie activity in the surrounding areas. With large groups of infected displaying coordinated movement patterns, and what appeared to be purposeful reconnaissance behavior that suggested either evolutionary adaptation or external control. The attack began just after midnight with a precision that immediately distinguished these zombies from the mindless hordes they'd encountered previously, as infected individuals used simple tools to disable external security systems, coordinated their assault to strike multiple defensive positions simultaneously, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that allowed them to overcome barriers that had successfully repelled previous attacks. Maria Santos found herself fighting alongside Elena to defend the main workshop area, while Marcus and Foster coordinated the community's response from the command center. But it quickly became apparent that these enhanced zombies possessed capabilities that rendered many of their defensive preparations obsolete. Dr. Mitchell was treating wounded defenders in the medical center when he noticed that several of the attacking zombies wore the remains of military uniforms and equipment, suggesting they might be the weaponized variants that Blake's resistance had described. But his observations were interrupted when Katie Harrison screamed from her defensive position near the food court, drawing everyone's attention to a horrifying sight. Elena had been bitten while protecting the teenager from a zombie that had somehow bypassed their security perimeters. The injury occurred during Elena's successful effort to save Katie from a zombie that had used a crowbar to pry open a ventilation grate, demonstrating tool use and tactical thinking that exceeded anything they'd previously witnessed. But the bite on Elena's forearm meant that their ticking clock scenario had begun, with Blake's immunity booster representing her only hope of avoiding the transformation that had claimed billions of lives worldwide. The battle continued through the night as Santos's people fought desperately to protect their community, while Elena's condition became the focus of agonizing debates about whether Blake's experimental treatment could save her, whether she should be isolated from the group, and most painfully, whether they had the right to risk everyone's safety for one person's uncertain survival in a world where such choices had become routine expressions of love, loyalty, and the desperate human need to believe that some lives still mattered enough to fight for regardless of the odds or consequences. Elena's deteriorating condition became the driving force behind their desperate push toward Washington, D.C., her fever climbing steadily despite Blake's immunity booster injections, while her bite wound developed the telltale discoloration that every survivor had learned to fear above all other symptoms. Maria Santos had insisted on joining their mission with 12 of her most capable fighters, including her Lieutenant Rodriguez and communications specialist Williams, bringing with them detailed intelligence about the route ahead and portable equipment that would prove essential for their infiltration of the government sector. The journey through Illinois and Indiana revealed a landscape that had been systematically divided into zones of control, with government forces maintaining heavily fortified corridors along major transportation routes, while zombie-controlled territories filled the spaces between, creating a patchwork of death and oppression that forced travelers to navigate an ever-changing maze of checkpoints, patrol routes, and infected populations that seemed to be growing more organized and dangerous with each passing day. Blake's intelligence network had provided them with contacts in the neutral zone surrounding Washington, D.C., a lawless territory where desperate survivors traded information, supplies, and services under the watchful eyes of government snipers and zombie hordes that served as natural barriers preventing unauthorized access to the capital region. Elena's condition worsened as they approached the city, her consciousness flickering between lucid moments where she could engage in conversation and planning, and periods of delirium where she muttered about voices calling to her from the darkness and strange dreams that seemed to involve communication with the infected populations they encountered along their route. Dr. Mitchell documented her symptoms with scientific precision, while privately fearing that Blake's immunity booster was failing to prevent her transformation. Though he noticed unusual aspects to her condition that didn't match the typical progression patterns he'd observed in other bite victims during their 3 years of survival. The neutral zone proved to be a surreal marketplace of desperation where former government officials traded state secrets for food. Military deserters sold weapons and ammunition to the highest bidders, and information brokers dealt in intelligence about safe passage routes, government facility layouts, and the locations of other survivor communities that had managed to avoid capture by Anderson's collection operations. Marcus made contact with Blake's primary intelligence source, a former NSA analyst named David Park who'd been living in the neutral zone for over a year while gathering evidence about the shadow government's reconstruction plans and the true purpose of the massive laboratory complex that had been constructed beneath the ruins of several government buildings in the secured sector. Park's information painted a horrifying picture of the facility they were attempting to infiltrate. A multi-level underground complex where thousands of survivors were being held in various stages of experimentation, with different sections dedicated to creating hybrid human-zombie soldiers, developing new strains of the infection for specific applications, and most disturbing of all, testing methods for controlling large populations of zombies as a labor force for reconstruction projects. Elena's transformation accelerated as they prepared for their infiltration attempt, but instead of losing her humanity to mindless hunger, she began demonstrating abilities that seemed to bridge the gap between human consciousness and zombie physiology, including enhanced strength and healing capabilities, resistance to pain and fatigue, and most remarkably, an apparent ability to sense and communicate with nearby infected individuals. The discovery that Elena was becoming something unprecedented rather than simply another zombie forced the group to reconsider their assumptions about the infection and its effects. While her claims that she could hear the thoughts and emotions of zombies suggested that the infected retained more of their original personalities than anyone had previously believed possible. Maria Santos's tactical expertise proved invaluable as they planned their approach to the government facility. Using intelligence from Park's network to identify security weaknesses, guard rotation patterns, and the location of the broadcast equipment they would need to access if they hoped to transmit Blake's research to survivor communities worldwide. The facility's security systems included both human guards and controlled zombie patrols, with the infected individuals wearing specialized restraint devices that allowed government operators to direct their movements and aggression towards specific targets, creating a nightmarish fusion of biological weapon and security system that made conventional infiltration techniques nearly impossible. Foster's police training and Santos's engineering background combined to develop an infiltration plan that exploited the facility's reliance on automated systems and predictable patrol routes. But their strategy required Elena's unique abilities to communicate with the zombie guards and potentially turn them against their controllers if her transformation continued to develop along its current trajectory. Dr. Mitchell administered what might be Blake's final immunity booster injection to Elena as they approached the facility's outer perimeter, knowing that her survival now depended on factors beyond medical science and into realms of biological adaptation that no one fully understood. The government complex rose from the ruins of downtown Washington like a monument to authoritarian ambition, its imposing structure surrounded by layers of security barriers, automated weapons systems, and patrol routes that channeled any approach through carefully controlled killing zones where intruders could be eliminated or captured according to the preferences of the facility's operators. Blake's research data and Elena's developing abilities represented their only advantages as they prepared to enter a facility designed to process, experiment on, and ultimately dispose of people exactly like themselves, while the knowledge that time was running out for Elena, and potentially for every survivor community still fighting for freedom added urgency to a mission that already seemed impossible by any rational calculation. The distant sound of helicopters and the systematic sweep patterns of government search teams suggested that Anderson's forces were still pursuing them, while Elena's whispered conversations with voices only she could hear hinted that their infiltration might trigger consequences that would reshape the relationship between the living and the dead in ways that none of them could predict or control. The government facility stretched beneath Washington, D.C., like a subterranean city of horrors, Its sterile corridors lined with observation windows that revealed experimentation chambers containing hundreds of test subjects in various stages of transformation, psychological conditioning, and medical procedures that defied every principle of human dignity and scientific ethics that had once governed civilized society. Elena's hybrid abilities proved essential to their infiltration, as she communicated with the zombie guards through methods that seemed to bypass their control devices, convincing them to ignore the intruders or even actively assist their movement through security checkpoints where human guards would have immediately detected their presence. Dr. Mitchell found himself confronting the full scope of the governance research program as they moved deeper into the facility. Observing laboratories where scientists in hazmat suits conducted experiments on conscious victims who retained enough awareness to scream, but lacked the motor control to escape their restraints, while adjacent chambers housed successful hybrid subjects who demonstrated the enhanced physical capabilities and retained intelligence that the researchers were attempting to perfect for military applications. The children's wing proved to be the most devastating discovery, containing dozens of young survivors who'd been promised safety and medical treatment, but instead found themselves subjects in studies designed to determine the optimal age for various types of infection and transformation. Their small bodies connected to monitoring equipment that tracked the progression of deliberately induced zombie variants, while researchers took detailed notes about pain responses, cognitive retention, and behavioral modification techniques. Maria Santos had to physically restrain Marcus from immediately attacking the researchers they encountered, reminding him through gritted teeth that their mission required stealth, and that a premature confrontation would doom not only their own group, but also the hundreds of prisoners who depended on their success to have any hope of rescue or revenge. Foster's police training helped her maintain tactical discipline as they navigated the facility's security systems. But even her professional composure cracked when they discovered holding areas where survivors were being sorted according to physical characteristics, medical history, and psychological profiles that determined their assignment to different experimental programs, including hybrid soldier development, zombie labor force creation, and most horrifically, breeding programs designed to produce children who could be infected from birth and raised as controllable hybrid workers. Elena's connection to the facility's zombie population revealed that many of the infected subjects retained fragments of their original memories and personalities, experiencing their transformation as a form of conscious imprisonment where they could observe their actions but couldn't control their bodies, creating a population of psychological torture victims who'd been deliberately maintained in states of awareness for research purposes. Blake's intelligence about the facility's layout proved accurate as they located the central laboratory where the real cure was being developed, not as a treatment to reverse the infection, but as a method to selectively control which populations would be allowed to maintain their humanity, while others were converted into various categories of zombie workers, soldiers, and test subjects according to the Shadow government's post-apocalypse reconstruction plans. The massive prison break that followed Elena's communication with the infected population created chaos throughout the facility as hundreds of zombie subjects turned against their controllers, their retained human memories providing them with knowledge about security systems, guard rotations, and facility layouts that made them far more dangerous than the researchers had anticipated. Dr. Mitchell worked frantically to gather samples of the cure formulations while Elena coordinated the uprising, her unique position as a conscious hybrid allowing her to serve as a bridge between the human prisoners and zombie subjects who were discovering that cooperation offered their only hope of escape from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. The battle that raged through the facility's corridors became a three-way conflict as government security forces fought against escaped prisoners, controlled zombies turned against their handlers, and research staff attempted to evacuate critical data and specimens while destroying evidence of their crimes against humanity. Marcus found himself face-to-face with Colonel Anderson in the facility's command center, where the colonel revealed with chilling matter-of-factness that the survivor collection operations had been merely the preliminary phase of a much larger program designed to rebuild American society, with a strictly controlled population of enhanced humans ruling over zombie labor forces that would perform all dangerous and undesirable work without requiring wages, health care, or human rights protections. The confrontation between Marcus and Anderson became a symbol of the larger struggle between humanity's best and worst impulses. As the colonel argued that his methods were necessary for species survival, while Marcus fought to preserve the values and freedoms that had made survival worthwhile in the first place. Elena's sacrifice became inevitable as she realized that her unique abilities made her the only person capable of coordinating the massive zombie uprising that would be necessary to destroy the facility and prevent the government's plans from reaching their final implementation phase. But her decision to remain behind meant abandoning any hope of finding a cure for her own condition and accepting transformation into something that might no longer be recognizably human. The explosion of violence that followed Elena's final communication with the facility's zombie population turned the underground complex into a battlefield where former victims became instruments of justice, research subjects became freedom fighters, and the careful control systems that had maintained order collapsed into revolutionary chaos that threatened to consume everything the shadow government had built from the ashes of the old world. Dr. Mitchell's discovery that the cure samples were designed to be selective rather than universal forced the group to confront the possibility that saving humanity might require choosing which people deserve to remain human. While Elena's deteriorating condition and growing connection to the zombie consciousness suggested that the lines between victim and monster had become too blurred to matter in any traditional sense of justice or redemption. The facility shook with explosions and gunfire as chaos consumed every level of the underground complex, while Elena's transformation reached its final stage in the broadcast control room, where she worked desperately to maintain her human consciousness long enough to coordinate the zombie uprising that had turned the government's own weapons against their creators. Dr. Mitchell faced an agonizing decision as he analyzed the cure samples they'd recovered, discovering that the formulation would indeed reverse the zombie infection, but would also kill every infected individual in the process, including Elena and the thousands of hybrid subjects who had retained their humanity despite their physical transformation. Blake's research data, combined with the facility's advanced equipment, offered a third possibility that Dr. Mitchell had never dared to imagine: a treatment that could gradually reverse the infection while preserving the consciousness and memories of the infected, allowing zombies to slowly regain their humanity over a period of months, rather than dying in the process of being cured. Marcus fought his way through corridors filled with smoke and violence as government forces attempted to maintain control, while being overwhelmed by their own former test subjects, the zombie uprising having destroyed the careful balance of power that had kept the facility operating for months or possibly years. Foster and Santos led rescue operations that freed hundreds of human prisoners from their holding cells, but the evacuees included many who'd been subjected to psychological conditioning and medical procedures that left them traumatized beyond immediate recovery, requiring ongoing care and support that would strain any survivor community's resources. The twins Katie and Josh Harrison had grown into seasoned fighters during their journey, but nothing had prepared them for the systematic horrors they witnessed as they helped evacuate the children's wing, where young survivors bore physical and psychological scars that would take years to heal, assuming they could find communities willing and able to provide the specialized care such victims required. Elena's final sacrifice unfolded in the broadcast control room as she used her hybrid abilities to communicate with zombies throughout the facility and beyond, turning them against Anderson's forces while simultaneously transmitting Dr. Mitchell's treatment formula to survivor communities across the globe, her actions ensuring that the knowledge would survive even if none of them escaped the facility alive. Colonel Anderson's last stand took place in the facility's core laboratory, where he attempted to destroy the research data and cure samples Rather than allow them to fall into the hands of people he considered enemies of the New World Order he'd helped to create. His fanatical dedication to authoritarian control, making him willing to condemn humanity to permanent infection rather than accept a solution that didn't serve his political agenda. The battle between Marcus and Anderson became a fight for the soul of post-apocalypse America, as the Colonel revealed that similar facilities existed across the former United States and around the world, all working toward the same goal of creating a stratified society where enhanced humans ruled over zombie workers in a system that would eliminate democracy, individual rights, and human dignity in favor of efficient resource management and population control. Elena's deteriorating condition forced her to make increasingly desperate choices as she balanced her fading humanity against the need to maintain control over the zombie forces that were her only weapon against the government's superior firepower and training, her sacrifice becoming more profound as she realized that saving others would cost her any chance of ever returning to her original form. Dr. Mitchell's breakthrough came as he combined Blake's immunity research with the facility's cure samples and his own veterinary knowledge of infectious diseases, creating a treatment protocol that could be manufactured using equipment available to survivor communities and administered safely without the complex medical infrastructure that the government's version required. The transmission that Elena broadcast to the world contained not only the treatment formula, but also detailed evidence of the government's crimes, the locations of other facilities, and instructions for manufacturing the gradual cure that would allow zombie populations to slowly regain their humanity while preserving their memories and personalities. Marcus reached the broadcast room just as Elena completed her final transmission, her transformation now so complete that only her eyes remained recognizably human. But her sacrifice had ensured that the knowledge needed to heal the world would reach every survivor community with the equipment to receive radio signals. The facility's destruction began with controlled explosions that Elena triggered using her connection to the zombie population, as infected subjects throughout the complex simultaneously attacked critical systems and infrastructure, bringing down the underground laboratories in a coordinated act of rebellion that buried Anderson's operation beneath tons of concrete and steel. The survivors who escaped the facility emerged into a world that was already beginning to change as radio operators in survivor communities received Elena's transmission and began preparing to manufacture the treatment that would offer hope to both the living and the infected. While the evidence of government crimes sparked uprisings in other facilities and military units that had been questioning their orders. Marcus stood in the ruins of the facility as dawn broke over Washington, D.C., holding Elena's final radio message that contained not only the cure formula, but also her personal farewell to the people she'd fought beside. Her words serving as a reminder that the victory they'd achieved had been purchased with the sacrifice of someone who'd chosen to give up her own humanity to preserve everyone else's. The epilogue that followed showed survivor communities around the world beginning the long process of administering the gradual cure to zombie populations. While the evidence Elena had broadcast sparked investigations, trials, and reforms that would prevent similar atrocities from occurring as humanity slowly rebuilt its civilization on foundations of justice, compassion, and respect for human dignity, rather than the authoritarian efficiency that had nearly destroyed everything worth saving.